One of the big announcements of the month came when Limited Run Games revealed the existence of Bubsy and the Purrfect Collection. This upcoming compilation will bring together all of the Bobcat's classic adventures in one cool package. While it's not exactly clear what's going to come in the collection, the Steam page suggests that we're not only going to get the console releases, but also the Game Boy and Jaguar games, as well as Bubsy 3D. Yeah, that's exciting news. But are any of these games actually worth playing? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Next Generation, Die Hard Game Fan, and more classic magazines to see what the critics said back when these games first came out. So brace yourself for a whole lot of puns and cat-itude, because it's time for another hysterical episode of Limited Run Review Crew. Bubsy the Bobcat is a tough character to talk about because while he's nowhere near as bad as what modern critics would like you to believe, he's also just the perfect embodiment of the 1990s gluttony for mascot characters with extreme attitudes. He's one of the million snarky animal heroes that were born out of the success of Sonic the Hedgehog, and he shot onto the scene with a level of bravado that was both unearned and just impossible to live up to. There's a weird tug-of-war happening where on one hand he's a cartoon cat that was clearly inspired by Looney Tunes, yet the other side wants him to be as effortlessly cool as like Sonic the Hedgehog or Earthworm Jim. Of course, the problem is that neither he nor his games are good enough to live up to the potential of either of those sides, leaving us in what is a very frustrating draw. Of course, all that is easy to say in retrospect, but what about at the time? For a character who often finds himself on a bunch of worst of lists, Bubsy the Bobcat actually started his life with the critics giving him all the charity in the world. While most of the reviews for Claw's Encounters of the Furred Kind are not on the same level as, say, Mario or Sonic, I think it's safe to say that the critics actually started out liking Bubsy. That's certainly the case with Electronic Gaming Monthly, who gave his first adventure an average score of 8 out of 10. Ed came out on the side of loving Bubsy, asking straight up if 1993 was the year of the Bobcat. After playing this card, I can truly say the game is terrific. Bubsy's tons of animation really add a humorous side to the game, and his voice before each level is also funny. The level effects are great, with colorful graphics and many hidden areas to find. What more could you ask for? Steve, on the other hand, was not as impressed, giving the game a 7. While I enjoyed the detail in Bubsy, the play mechanics and lack of diversified technique to learn and master brought this cart down a couple of points. All the elements are here, but a lot of the finesse that similar games demand just isn't found here. EGM's 8 out of 10 is pretty close to the average across all magazines. That's the same score you saw from Mean Machine Sega in their 11th issue, and Computer and Video Games went a little bit higher, giving it an 81%. You also saw Die Hard Game Fan give the Super NES version of the game an 83%, while the Genesis version was just 1 point higher, coming in with an 84%. Of course, the highest score came from GamePro, who gave both versions a perfect 5 out of 5. They raved that Bubsy is a must for any gamer's library. On the trail of Sonic the Hedgehog, this cat really moves. He may not be as fast as Sonic, but he definitely has a lot more personality. Oh boy. Unfortunately, not all the reviews were that positive. In fact, there were a few critics that were not fully won over by Bubsy's charm. For example, Video Games and Computer Entertainment scored the game a slightly low 7.8 out of 10. Same as Superplay, who gave it a 77%, making it the magazine's 246th best reviewed Super NES game. SNES Force averaged a score of 70%, though that score would have been much lower if Will had been the sole reviewer. If the programmers wanted a speedy Sonic-type game, why'd they make Bubsy a one-hit-and-die character, then put enemies virtually every 2 inches? Bubsy just doesn't have the speed of play. Sure, he can move as fast as Sonic, but he can't make long sprints until the background blurs because he hits a baddie every 2 seconds and has to redo the level. There are some nice graphics, nice touches here and there, but Bubsy is just too frustrating. This cat is lucky there's no Hedgehog on Nintendo. Other low scores include Megatech giving the Genesis version a 74%, and Sega Power giving it an even lower 69%. Nice. The score that surprised me the most came from Nintendo Power, which gave Bubsy a 3.5 out of 5. That may not sound so bad, but it's actually shockingly low for the magazine. They raved that this has some of the best character animation ever seen in a video game, as well as speed, challenge, and 16 ways to bite the big one. They called it one of the best character action games around. However, they felt that during high jumps, the multi-background parallax view can cause havoc to your sense of direction and placement, resulting in poor landings. Hey, I always thought cats were supposed to land on their feet. Look, despite a few negative takes, this first Bubsy was actually mostly well-liked. Let's see if that trend continues with the sequels and spin-offs. Before we dive into the 16-bit sequel, let's first take a quick look at Bubsy's first and only foray into the world of handheld consoles. While you might think that this is just a shrunk-down version of the Super NES and Genesis game, Bubsy II on the Game Boy is actually a whole different beast. It retains all the same basic platforming gameplay, but with all new levels that are more in line with what you'd expect from an 8-bit handheld. Released about a year after the console sequel, most magazines opted to just ignore this version altogether, and the few that did cover it couldn't agree whether it was good or terrible. For example, I would put Electronic Gaming Monthly in the "it's fine" camp, giving it an average score of 6 out of 10. EGM concluded that the Talking Bobcat takes his show to the Game Boy platform and does pretty well. It's the usual jump on an enemy and get through the level routine. Even if you never played them before, this is a good introduction. Nintendo Power also didn't hate the game, giving Bubsy II a score of 3.1 out of 5. However, the same cannot be said for GamePro, who gave it a 1 out of 5. Easily one of the lowest scores we've ever seen from the publication. Hopefully, Bubsy hasn't used up all of his 9 lives yet, because this game will certainly take away one of them. Poor graphics and gameplay, as well as a personality shortage, makes Bubsy II anything but the cat's meow. Man, who did Bubsy piss off over at GamePro? This might actually be the harshest review that we've ever seen from the usually good-natured magazine. Sadly, there is some truth to the harshness. Bubsy II on the Game Boy isn't very good. Let's see how the console version fares. After the successful debut of Bubsy, Accolade had big plans for the Bobcat. They hoped to parlay the strong game sales into a popular television show, shrink Bubsy down to fit on the Game Boy, and release an even bigger sequel for the Super Nintendo and Genesis. Unfortunately, things did not go as planned. The cartoon series didn't get picked up, and we already know how the Game Boy version turned out. But hey, what about Bubsy 2? If you're looking for that moment when critics and fans first started to turn on the Bobcat, I'd point my finger at this 1994 sequel. Despite adding new elements like a level select and marble collecting, Bubsy 2 failed to attract the same kind of sales as the original. And as you'll see from the reviews, even the critics were starting to turn on the mascot. Now, to be fair, there were a lot of magazines that genuinely liked this follow-up. GamePro gave the Super NES version a score of 4 out of 5, only 1 point lower than the 1993 original. Mean Machine Sega went even higher, giving the Genesis version a score of 84%. There are those who dismiss platformers as being too alike in content and action, Certainly, this is the case among many of today's offerings. Yet Bubsy has a certain edge over the rest of the competition, and that edge is called fun! Sure, there are faults, but the characterization is so charming that these faults are soon ignored. Bubsy II is what a platform game should be. The levels are immense and stacked high with goodies, and the baddies are nicely stompable. If it's platform bobcat action you're after, you can't go wrong with this offering. From here, the scores start to drop. For example, Sega Power gave the Genesis version a score of 72% in their 60th issue, while Game Players went down to a 64%. Over in Australia, Hyper gave the Genesis version a score of 61%, complaining that Bubsy 2 is pretty much the same game as the old Bubsy. All that's changed are the levels. The animation is the same with no real improvements to speak of. The sound effects are a little better this time around, with sampled effects for a lot of the obstacles, but the music is pretty dire. The backgrounds are sometimes pretty special, with multi-level parallax scrolling being the norm in many of the rounds. But a lot of levels have you wandering aimlessly trying to find the elusive exit, with arrow signs constantly pointing you in the wrong direction. Very frustrating. It looks like Accolade didn't learn from their mistakes, as they've released another half-baked rush title in Bubsy 2. Give Bubsy to some decent programmers with an imagination and you can have a Sonic beater. But until then, rent if you must. This is basically the range where most of the reviews land. Video Games Magazine went with a 6 out of 10, which is basically the same grade GamePro gave the Genesis version when they scored it a 3 out of 5. The lowest score came from Die Hard Game Fan, who gave it an average of 55%. Skip called it a disappointment. Bubsy 2 is nothing like Part 1. The levels are designed terrible, the collision detection is off by a mile, and the artwork is mediocre at best. A character with so much recognition as Bubsy deserves better. The Inquirer liked the game enough to give it a 60% grade, but still agreed that Bubsy 2 was a disappointment. What happened to the Bubster? I kinda liked the first game. As a Sonic-ish platformer, I thought Bubsy was gonna be a successful series. But after this disaster, that's hard to imagine. Look, as much as I'd like to disagree with most of the critical takes here, I feel a lot truer now than ever. Bubsy 2 didn't do much to push the envelope, revealing all of my worst fears about the first game. That's not to say that you can't have any fun with Bubsy 2, but this truly was the beginning of the end for the Bobcat. Fans of the Bobcat didn't have to wait long for their next fix, because Bubsy in Fractured Furry Tales was released just a couple of months after Bubsy 2 on the Genesis and Super Nintendo. Unfortunately, there's a catch, and that is, you had to own a Jaguar. Oft forgotten, this fairy tale installment is the Bobcat's first appearance on a next-generation console, though the result isn't as impressive as the 64 bits would have you believe. This is very much in the same vein as the previous entries, only now we play through levels based on Alice in Wonderland, Jack and the Beanstalk, Hansel and Gretel, and other familiar stories. It's not the best Bubsy game, but hey, at least it finds a good theme and commits to it. That's more than I can say about most of the games in this series. Alright, let's start with the good news. Electronic Gaming Monthly gave Bubsy a score of 6.4 out of 10. How is that good news, you may ask? Well, that's because a 6.4 is actually the most generous score given out at the time. The Capsule Reviews proclaims the Talking Bobcat is back! Bubsy fans will love this version of the popular character, and this one will prove challenging to even the most hardened veterans of the series. The levels are huge, the graphics are very detailed, and the sound is equally impressive. Non-Bubsy fans probably won't be converted, but those raised on the feline will obviously take to the character. Just one quibble though, the control could be tweaked a bit. Otherwise, it's a fine game. Yeah, unfortunately, it's all downhill from here. Game players, for example, gave the Jaguar version of the game a pathetic 45%. Video Games, the ultimate gaming magazine, their words not mine, went even lower, giving it a 4. It's not a 4 out of 5, but rather a 4 out of 10. And that's not even the worst part, because Jim Loftus actually compares Bubsy to the Great Games Crash. If there's one thing that Bubsy is, it's consistent. This time, we're offered more of the same uninspired run, jump, and pretend you're having a good time play mechanics. To add insult to injury, this is supposed to be 64-bit. I'm sorry, but enough is enough. I have nothing against action platformers, as long as I'm given the impression that someone actually cared about the finished product. But if the market becomes flooded with games like this, then we're all in trouble. This is the type of product which spelled disaster for us the first time, and I'd hate to see it happen again. Of course, these aren't the only negative reviews for Fractured Furry Tales. GamePro gave this so-called 64-bitter a 2.5 out of 5, making it one of their worst reviewed games of the year. Next Generation went even lower, giving it a 2 out of 5. Similar in play to just about every side-scrolling jumper ever made, apologies to Mario, Sonic, Arrow, and Artie Lightfoot, Furry Tales actually comes off looking good in Atari's true color technology. Players will run, jump, and glide their way around 15 different levels in Fairy Tale Land, looking to repair damage that's tainted the fables of the world. Not a bad title, but platform fans will probably find Zool 2 to be more entertaining and a lot more innovative. You know, if critics were starting to flirt with breaking up with the Bobcat after Bubsy II, I think it's fair to say that they are asking for a divorce after Fractured Furry Tales. Sadly, this is just the beginning of Bubsy's woes. There's just one last thing to do, and none of us want to do it. Alright, bring on Bubsy 3D. If Super Mario 64 showed the world how to take a beloved side-scrolling platformer and reinvent it in 3D, then Bubsy 3D showed us what not to do. This is one of the most infamous games of all time. It's a game so reviled that it effectively killed the Bubsy the Bobcat franchise. Of course, this 3D entry wasn't all to blame, as sales were down for Bubsy's previous outings, and the next generation was notoriously brutal for all 16-bit mascots that were not named Mario. Still, Bubsy 3D and its terrible graphics and bad gameplay essentially acted like the final nail in the coffin. It put the once promising character on ice for more than 20 years. And even offered a sobering lesson about what could go wrong if you end up biting off more than you could chew. Now, for a game that effectively killed a franchise, Bubsy 3D's reviews aren't as bad as you might expect. The worst score actually came from Electronic Gaming Monthly, who gave it a 3.25 out of 10, making it the third worst reviewed game of that year. On the high end was Dan, who seemed to be in physical pain while reviewing Bubsy 3D. Ouch! And I mean ouch! This game, I'm sorry to say, and I really mean it, is not good at all. The control is poor, Bubsy is very hard to control in 3 dimensions. You can run around, but maneuvering quickly? Forget about it! Bubsy should have stayed as a side-scroller. On the lower end, Sushi X gave the Bobcat a 2.5 out of 10. No, this is not how you treat a perfectly good mascot. What I'd like to see come of this review is a return to the drawing board for poor Bubsy 3D. Absolutely no texture mapping is used, so the lack of numerous polygons is painfully obvious. Pretend your controller is filled with mud, because that's how Bubsy plays. I fought with the controller the whole time, and the experience was frustrating. Next Generation also hated the game, though not enough to give it their lowest score. Earning a 2 out of 5, they argued that it's possible to get used to the bad gameplay and crummy visuals. But, more times than not, failing to accomplish something and dying occur because the control problems or poor camera positioning. And nothing is more frustrating than blowing it purely because the character didn't do what you wanted him to do. With plenty of levels and a nifty 2-player game, the game isn't without value. Like its 16-bit predecessors, Bubsy 3D is several platforms short of the top floor. Now, here's the surprising thing about the Bubsy 3D reviews. Not all of them are bad. For example, GamePro gave the game a 3 out of 5. Not great, sure, but also not one of the worst scores of that year. GameFan was even more shocking, giving this 3D entry a baffling average of, get this, 80%. No, really. eStorm admits that at first glance, Bubsy 3D may look simplistic, but further investigation uncovers a deep and very entertaining excursion into the depths of Rayon. As the whimsical soundtrack hums along, you'll guide Bubsy in and out of some truly unique game environments, all nicely texture mapped and garage shaded. The 3D engine takes some getting used to, but once you're in tune with it, it all comes together, leaving you warm and fuzzy. Ah, I bet you didn't have that on your bingo card! These days, the only real reason you have to play Bubsy 3D is simply out of curiosity. It's far from the best game starring the Bobcat, but at least it shows an attempt to shake up the formula. There, I said something good about Bubsy 3D. It's all you're getting from me. Hey, thanks for watching me break down these classic reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new episodes every time limited run games, Nintendo, Sony, or really anybody releases classic games. I have a whole playlist with just so many Review Crew episodes to watch. Give it a binge. Now, here's the question I have for you. What's your favorite Bubsy game? Is it one of these classics? Or maybe you're partial to the newer installments? The critics seem to like the first game the most, but maybe you're into Fractured Furry Tales, or, oh god forbid, even Bubsy 3D. Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back on Monday with a mid-year report card crunching the numbers for the Nintendo Switch Online. How does it match up against past years? Find out next week. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.